England's journey is nothing short of a miracle. As a people, the British have stayed on task for hundreds of years, settling the huge challenges of any successful civilization, such as religious freedom, slavery abolition, consensus for democratic rule, consensus for royal rule, and territorial disputes. It is easy to forget that Britain is a project that has taken centuries of infighting, despair, difficulty, and hope to consolidate both its culture and its security to allow its people to flourish. We have lost sight of this extraordinary achievement. So to get us back on track, the track that sees us willing once again to be proud of these isles and to remember that there are very few nations on earth that enjoy the freedom we enjoy, just how did we get here? The story of Britain's pivot to the democratic system we have now was carved out nearly 400 years ago, in the year of our Lord, 1649. Let us go back. On a freezing cold day in January 1649, Britain's king, Charles I, was to be executed. A nation still experiencing growing pains, Britain had made the decision to become a republic. The king had been reckless in his attempts to commit the country to a war it didn't want, using resources it would rather not squander. King Charles had, during the 1640s, become more and more autonomous, using his own royalist army to commit Britain to wars that Parliament objected to, before finally turning his army against the parliamentary army. King Charles, as is befitting of most kings, queens, and emperors in history, believed he could act with impunity. This, a monumental moment in British history, would change the course of Britain for the better, forever. But it would not be without complications. Executing your own king is hardly the soft option. Removing the most powerful man in the kingdom would send a clear message. But as the newly formed Council of State would discover, a nation without a clear image of power at the top goes aimlessly nowhere, fast. 400 years prior to these events, in the year 1215, the precedent for such a monumentous decision was formed. Magna Carta, the lawful document of the land that established the principle that everybody, including the king, was subject to the law. With the king removed, Britain decided on a path of governance. The precedent had been established. The people are the source of all sovereignty and the basis of the law. The monarch was but an officer in trust. The precedent exists still to this day. England was not formed by a committee of overpaid middle managers and bureaucrats. It has spilled blood over centuries. There was a time in our history when even the king was not spared the rule of law. Here, the great disparity between our modern era and the past lies. Our leaders in the past had true skin in the game. In other words, a king could be executed for their actions. Those that chose to execute the king had to live with the consequences of this action. When the royalist army and the parliamentary army fought each other, they were led by figures that would ride into battle with them. This was expected of a true courageous warrior. Contrast that with today's cowardice. We are so far removed from the consequences of our actions. The middle manager administrative class that I spoke of earlier, this sect of unremarkable, uninspiring tyrants of mediocre people that seem to be running our institutions, are entirely academic in their approach. Everything they stand for is theory-based. Every action they take is via a computer screen. They have no skin in the game. One of the most interesting aspects, not just about the 17th century, but about any period of history prior to about 100 years ago, is the level of hardship all people went through daily. Basic things like no heated homes except for a fire in one room if you were fortunate, no lit rooms as candles were too expensive, no running water, no toilets except for a bucket, no cozy beds with duvets, no pajamas, no refrigerator, etc. Yet people were still able to engage with life. They still achieved things. They still made something of their life. Even though much of life, especially in the bitterly cold, must have been abject hardship. I recoil in horror in my own time when I hear people complain of the slightest inconvenience or dissatisfaction, as if the world always owes them nothing but maximal comfort. And perhaps this is why we are being diagnosed with depressive disorders at an ever-increasing rate. Man's noble quest for a comfortable life has removed the need for man to struggle. So it struggles by demanding to speak to the manager or complains about the weather. In many ways, Britain in the 21st century has echoes of Britain in the 17th century. Fortunately for all of us, we can battle it out without spilling blood, and our houses are at least warm and watered. Although perhaps that is why we are not mad enough. For example, much of the 17th century turmoil was Britain deciding on its ideological outlook, as well as consolidating its borders in Ireland. The argument at the time was largely a religious one, but also one of style of governance. On the religious front, Britain was split by those engaged in a more purist, dogmatic view of Christianity on the one side, and those that were less extreme in their views on the other side. Those that were more extreme were called Puritans and believed, among other things, that things like dancing, theatres and enjoyment in general were sinful, and that the Catholic Church was a compromised institution. We can compare this to modern times with those that believe overcorrecting for historic misgivings, such as race and gender inequities, is necessary versus those that believe the civil rights movement did as much as was possible to correct these ills, and that broadly it has solved the social problem. The term for the former category is woke, a term I despise, but is effective in its use. They mostly resemble the tyrannical, ideologically captured Puritans of the 17th century, and despite them being the minority, both the Puritans and the overcorrecting wokies of the modern era exerted control and influence on culture. They believe they are espousing the purest version of social justice, excluding anyone that strays from the cult. On the 30th of January 1649, the king was executed. Shortly after, some 8 days or so, the monarchy and the House of Lords was abolished. The House of Commons declared itself the single sovereign body. The new executive body would be called the Council of State and would manage the day-to-day of the government. John Bradshaw, the man that had been president of the court that tried King Charles, would eventually, reluctantly, become president of the Council of State. Things got off to a great start. There was a high spirit, a belief that things would be run in a more egalitarian way, but like a house built on poor foundations during an earthquake, things were very, very shaky. Becoming head of state was a dastardly affair, mind you. Although there had been no organised attempt to thwart the execution of the king, it was clear that popular opinion was against it. A colleague of John Bradshaw's was butchered to death by daggers in The Hague by royalists. Bradshaw was a target, and he knew it. One of the benefits of living in this modern time is that we seem to be capable of expressing our outrage, which is in plentiful supply, without daggers. But the lessons of history are always the same. Turmoil breeds despair, despair breeds panic, and panic often returns us to the status quo, if it is still there. Britain would eventually call upon Oliver Cromwell to be Lord Protector. The most essential quality in a leader during this era was for that leader to demonstrate they had skin in the game. Cromwell found himself as supreme head of the English army after his predecessor, Lord Thomas Fairfax, an enormously respected figure, chose to step aside. He chose to step aside because the Council of State, despite being a newly formed executive body, wanted Scotland. And if the army was to have any hope of taking any territory, it needed not just to believe in their leader, but to fight beside him. This is skin in the game. It creates the greatest warriors and is distinctly lacking in modernity. Leaders are far removed from the consequences of their actions. Drone strikes are a prime example of this. Cromwell and his 16,000 men marched on southern Scotland and took it in September of 1650. The respect he gained by always practicing skin in the game, would be needed for when he would forcibly take Parliament lest it destroy itself. Every now and then, an empire has a good dictator. Think Aurelius or Augustus. Perhaps Cromwell was of that flavour. When the year was 1653 and New Britain was in turmoil, Cromwell had led something of a coup, forced Parliament to dissolve as it was becoming stagnant. This was a very risky move. It's one that history looks back on with praise though. Cromwell was made Lord Protector in December of 1654. A great inspirational leader is vital during times of strife. Most of the time, a leader of reasonable competency to simply steer the ship and make sure the country isn't run into the ground will do. The middle of the 17th century was a time of great turmoil for Britain, just like it is now. Oliver Cromwell, like many men of that era, suffered all manner of despair, including the death of his children. His first son died as a baby when Cromwell was just 18, an experience he described as a dagger to the heart. Cromwell grew up as the only boy in a family of 7 sisters, and so was naturally at ease in female company. This extended beyond his own daughters and wife to his daughters-in-law. As he explained when negotiating the dowry that was to come with his son Richard's bride, he had to be careful with money for the simple reason that I shall need it for my 2 wenches. When Oliver Cromwell passed on the 3rd of September 1658, he had, about a week before, made the curious decision to nominate his son, Richard, as his successor. The problem, of course, with hereditary dictatorships is that they only work if the dictator is a good one, which they rarely are. Richard was not evil, he just did not command the respect his father did. It wouldn't be long before he was forcibly removed. And thus the life of the Republic as a republic was short-lived. General George Monk, a Scotsman, would lead his army to London and lay down his life in mortal defence of the authority of the English Parliament. The title of Lord Protector had been abolished when Richard Cromwell had been deposed. England was at a crossroads. The future of the British Isles was in the balance. It hadn't been Monk's intention to restore the monarchy, but Charles Stuart, aka Charles II, was ready to return to the throne should he be invited to do so. Eventually, Monk was able to orchestrate a situation where pardons would be granted to those that had participated in the removal of the monarchy and agreement over the distribution of lands. The precedent of separating Parliament from monarchy was set, and this still exists today. The decision was ratified on the 26th of May 1660. King Charles II was rowed ashore in a ship that had carried him across the Channel, where he was met with thousands applauding their new king. The unique British power structure of Parliament and monarchy was re-established. It is easy to take for granted the hardship this nation has been through to arrive at the free society it is today. It is critical to remember, though, 2 things. Number 1, it has taken centuries for Britain to develop into what it is today. It endured pain, trauma, revolution, war, religious struggle. It has naturally grown into what it is, but it is not assured of anything. This could fall apart all too easily. And number 2, we cannot take for granted that our leaders and our institutions can be trusted to steer the ship. Actually, they are failing us. The people of this country are this country. We have always known that. Remember, the people are the source of all sovereignty and the basis of the law. The biggest difference between the 17th century and now is that we have developed systems to make change possible without violence. That being said, our threshold for action against the system seems to be very high. We are witnessing the desecration of a beautiful nation, but the question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to watch the Vandals sack the empire? Are you going to be persuaded that this country is for anyone to do with as they please? Are you going to overthrow the entire status quo and replace it? We owe it to those that suffered before us to keep Project Great Britain on the path it has forged for itself. Don't let them down.